All right. Hey, everybody. How's it going? Webcams are on. We're officially starting the broadcast, chatting a little bit here as we're waiting for people to come in since we did start right at the top of the hour. But we're both excited to have you here. In fact, we're in matching outfits today, as you can see, both in the KendoReact blue here, right, with the lovely Kendoka on it. So that's always fun to be matchies for the day. So I'm Carl Bergenham, product manager for Kendo UI, and that includes the Vue and React product. And TJ Van Tol is joining me here today to help cover the React portion. So I'll kick things off with a little bit of housekeeping first, and then cover the what's new in R3 2020 for Vue, and then TJ will follow up with the React pieces. So see that we still have some folks flowing in here. But because we're going to start with a couple of slides before we jump into the what's new, I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. So first, if you want to check out anything that we're covering today, just on your own time, maybe not necessarily in this webinar, we do have the Kendo UI What's New page that will cover absolutely everything that's new in Kendo UI. So that includes the jQuery components, the React components, the Angular components, and the Vue components. I just happened to take a screenshot here of the React updates in R3 2020. So a little bit of a sneak preview for TJ's session. But at any point in time, whether it's during the webinar or for whoever's watching this while it's recorded or afterwards, you do have access to the What's New page. You can get access to all the latest and greatest bits and pieces of information. A big question that oftentimes gets brought up while we're chatting here in the webinar is the session being recorded? And the answer is yes, indeed it is. And this will be posted on the Kendo UI YouTube channel, which actually you have the link for right here. So youtube.com/KendoUITV. And speaking of questions, by the way, I'm going to leave this up. You have a couple different ways you can get involved today, either asking me questions or TJ questions, or any one of the helpful helpers that we have in the background working on answering any questions that you might have. Over on the right-hand side, in your GoToWebinar interface, you'll see that there's a little chat area that you can type in any and all questions that you may have as we go through and talk about the release. Now, as I mentioned, we do have some folks helping out. So while I'm chatting, while TJ is going through and presenting his portion of the webinar, we will still be able to answer questions thanks to that helpful team working with us. So any and all questions that you have there, you can feel free to type away, and we'll try to address them as quickly as we can. Additionally, we'll also be trying to be paying attention to Twitter. So you have the hashtag #HeyKendoUI, where you can ask us questions as well. So we have a team monitoring those questions as we go through the presentation. So either through the GoToWebinar interface or through the hashtag on Twitter, you'll be able to get a hold of us. Now, when we talk about R3 2020, we are talking about all of Kendo UI, right? And I wanted to just give you an idea of just a whole release, since we're just covering two products today, and Angular and jQuery will be tomorrow. But I wanted to give everybody a full idea of what's happened in R3 2020. And as you can see, there are a ton of new features and a ton of new components across the board. Some might actually appear in multiple different libraries that we have, right? And some might be brand new just for those specific libraries. So you can see there's something for everybody with R3 2020. But today we are going to be focusing on the React portion and the Vue portion. So I'll kick things off by talking about the new pieces in Vue, and that includes support for Vue 3.0, the new combo box, the new AutoComplete, and the new MaskedTextBox, as well as some documentation and demo updates that we've done. And then TJ will cover all the new components that we have on the React side, so the Gantt, the app art, text area, rating, chip and chipless, and loader, as well as additional improvements that we've done to the grid, the editor, and of course, we've also done some documentation and demo updates there that he might cover a little bit more in detail. So with that being said, everybody, let's go ahead and dive into what's new in R3 2020 for Kendo UI for Vue. Woo! Yeah, it's exciting stuff. So I already kind of gave the agenda away a little bit here, right? But we're going to, first of all, talk about probably what's on everybody's top of their mind, right? Vue 3.0. So we'll just cover that Kendo UI for Vue officially supports Vue 3.0, which is very exciting. I know that I was personally waiting for the release of the latest version of Vue, and now we officially have support for it as well, which is great. And then we'll cover the new native components. So for those of you not familiar with Kendo UI for Vue, we have a set of wrapped components coming from our jQuery library, which is of course still available, and also Vue 3.0 compliant. But we're building out a native set of UI components from the ground up for Vue, and these are the components I'll be covering today. Most of what I'll be doing, by the way, will be in the demo, so we'll be able to take a live look at all the components. But first, let's cover Vue 3.0 support. So for those of you that might have caught the original release of R3 2020, which was on the 16th, so just a couple of days before the official release of Vue 3.0, we mentioned that we support the latest RC and the release candidate right up until then. Well, now I can also mention that we do officially support the official Vue 3.0 release, which is, of course, a big deal. So this includes the native components and the wrap components. So no matter what components you're using as a part of your Vue development, you do have the ability to upgrade your project to 3.0 and have ensured support from the Kendo UI components, which is always great. So that's the biggest thing for Vue 3.0. If you haven't been taking a look at what that brings, I definitely recommend taking a look at it. And of course, upgrading to the latest version of the Kendo UI components to be able to be compliant. Then we have the combo box. So the combo box, for those of you not familiar, is an input element that allows users to select from a particular list of values you can predefine. And in this particular case, we can see that they select cricket right in this animated GIF. But what's nice about the combo box is that it does have some capability for folks to be able to type in values. For example, you could even allow custom values. So if you want the user to add in an item that doesn't come from the drop-down list, you can definitely do so. So it's a little bit more than just a drop-down where you have a predetermined list and that's all that they can select from. And there's a lot of power that comes within this combo box, as we'll see when we jump over into the demos. Now, the autocomplete kind of continues the drop-down story in a way, where the autocomplete is essentially a text input that autocompletes users' input. So the idea here is that just like we see as somebody's typing out Albania here, as they are typing, the list can get filtered down. In this particular case, it doesn't, but you can actually configure how you want this to filter down. It can either be a starts with, a contains is exactly equal to. So you can modify the behavior of what the autocomplete does as a user inputs the whatever value it might be. Now, the power of this, right, is that you take up the real estate of a text box and a regular input, but you give a little bit of additional functionality to the user of selecting from a particular list of values. And you can be as strict or as loose as you want with the available values, but of course that list can expand and be data bound or manually created, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I'd say this is one of those that's harder to implement than it looks too, like especially the keyboard controls and the accessibility, like having a drop-in control is really nice because going down the path of doing this yourself, it gets messy as soon as you get like any level of complexity in this thing.
Yeah, it is interesting. Having attempted to create some components from scratch myself, I do, as soon as there's a pop-up like this, right, that's when I start running into problems, I'll be honest, making that look good. And like you said, even if you're able to get the functionality working, ensuring that it's accessible, and following the standards for, WCAG or Section 508 or, YARIA standards, right? That can be a little bit tricky. And that, of course, includes keyboard navigation and everything like that, which can quickly become a bit of a pain. And then also things like the Z index and ensuring that, if I add this as a part of like a form that's in a window, what does that look like, right? Yeah, there's a lot.
If you show autocomplete in a dialogue, right? Like,
yeah,
it's just craziness, right?
Exactly. So this continues the story of also expanding on the form components within Vue, which is one of the things that we're focusing on a lot of the last couple of releases. In fact, the next component, the MaskedTextBox, which can be a mouthful. Yeah, thank you. I'm proud of that segue. So the MaskedTextBox is another input element but it allows you to provide a predetermined mask for users to follow. So this isn't just like we see here, for example, a predefined number of digits and a format for that. And giving the user a hint of what should be inputted, this could actually be very strict. So when you define a mask for the mask text box, and let's say in this particular case, it's only supposed to be numbers, well, if the user tries to input any letters at all as they're typing through, they won't actually be able to type that in. The component will automatically prevent that kind of behavior. So it's very powerful for what it is, because once you define that initial mask, which can be anything that's out of the box, you can also have full control over the mask yourself. So if something very custom, or for a way that you need the user-centered data or whatever it might be, it can be predetermined through the configuration options, which gives you a lot of flexibility for how to use the mask text box.
This is also on my list of awful to implement on your own too.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea of creating a regex for anything gives me nightmares sometimes, because I think I know it, and then as soon as I actually get to implementing one, I realize that I don't. And there's some very smart people out there that can do that easily. Much respect to them.
Yep.
But yeah, just having something where you can essentially say at every index, that, okay, this is going to be the type of information that I want to have at this particular point as users are typing in, and it makes it a lot easier as well to define the mask, which is nice. And kind of a segue into the demos, we've also updated our docs and demos. And one of the reasons that I like to bring this up is because not only has it provided kind of a nice facelift, as we'll see throughout all the components and their various different features that we show off in the demos, we've actually done a ton of items under the hood as well. So for example, in some instances, these pages are now up to 400% faster than they were before this update. So we've done a lot to ensure that these pages load as fast as possible, no matter what kind of connection that you're on, which of course, how often do you navigate through documentation for components on your mobile device, right? But if you are playing around with it on a mobile device, it'll load that much faster. And ultimately that adds up over time, right? The amount of time I spend in our docs as I'm putting together samples and proof of concepts, whatever it might be, if I'm saving a couple of tenths of a second with every sample that I'm loading, that eventually adds up over the couple of weeks that I'm working on a project. And that can be some substantial savings as well. So we've done a ton there. And for Vue, we've actually gone through and revamped a lot of the demos to follow the best practices for Vue 3.0. So when we take a look at the samples that we have available, you'll see that we have a little bit of a different file structure than we had previously, which is just following the latest and greatest best practices, which also helps, of course, ensure that for folks looking to pick up Vue 3.0 or just follow best practices within the library, you have the ability to do so just by copying and pasting our demos. And with that being said, let's jump over into the demos. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to see if I can just quickly alt-tab over to them, and we should see that flip over. Perfect. There we go. So these are the new and updated documentation and demos. So as you can see here, we've not only highlighted a lot of the most popular native components up here at the top, we have a little bit more of a unique area specifically for the native components and the wrapped components. So depending on what you're looking to do, which components that you need, there might still be some cases where you need to pull in some of the jQuery components to kind of mix and match the components. What is nice, by the way, for those of you that are looking into doing this, is that the theme that you apply and the customization that you do to either one will apply. So let's say you happen to use the menu on the jQuery side, and once we release that native component for the Vue components, any customization that you've done to the CSS will apply to that as well. So that's a little nice thing to have in mind as you're potentially mixing and matching. But let's jump right into taking a look at some of the components that we have available. So this particular demo, I have it loaded up here in StackBlitz instead. But if we start with the autocomplete, you can see that we do have quite a lot of different articles you can check out. So for example, a quick getting started, where you can view the source or open in a StackBlitz in order to be able to edit it and play around with the sample. You can also get down into what I was talking about with filtering, for example, right? So if you want to be able to either do a minimum filter length, for example, or if you want to customize just how filtering is done on the data, you have an event that you can hook into that then through there you can go through and filter down some of the information. We also have the concept of custom rendering, so that if you want to give a little bit of a unique flair, so let's see if we can get Denmark in here, for example, if it's going to pop up. There we go. We see in this particular case, it didn't filter down, but what it allowed me to do is still have Denmark be available here. In this case, it's just kind of blue text as opposed to the standard text. But if you imagine, and I'm just going to quickly jump in here so you can just see what I'm talking about here, right? You can use a standard template in order to be able to define whatever you want in here. That could be, for example, adding a flag icon next to every country, right? Or if you're a big fan of emojis, you can add in an emoji next to the text in there. You have the capability of defining whatever you want to in this template. And of course, you get access to the data item, so it's nice and easy to work with.
You could even add emoji flags. You could put
exactly.
both worlds together. Like
exactly.
Forward thinking right here.
Both worlds, yeah. Exactly. I'm still looking for they introduced the pinching hand in emojis with Android 11. And even though I have Android 11, I still don't have access to that, but I still just want to do this all the time. So now finally, that's an emoji form, and that's coming for you iOS users. It is coming in the future. But let me zoom in a little bit here just to see how you implement the autocomplete. It is fairly easy to get up and running with. As you see here, by the way, on the left-hand side, we have main.view, where previously we just had everything in one single component. You can now see that we've separated things out a little bit, right? So this main.view, just because it's showing up one single component, that's all that we really need to worry about. We do pull in countries from this list of countries and countries.js. And really, just to get it up and running, that's all you need. We can see that we have data-items, which we bind to in order to get a list of countries. And then we have the placeholder. So, for example, this e.g. Denmark, but of course, we can just say, for example, we could do Bulgaria. A little shout out to our, no, I don't want to leave. I just want to have this up and running. So we see here now that is up here now running, and then we can see that Bulgaria is over there on the right-hand side. So the power of StackBlitz allows us to very quickly and easily update that. In case anybody's interested in the format of the data, this is all it is, just an array of strings with each particular country that we can see in here. Okay, so that's the autocomplete. Let's take a look at the combo box. So similar thing, right, where we have a list of all the available features that we can work with. So for example, I did mention the custom value, so you might want to be able to allow people to insert. So for example, here we have small, medium, and large, but if I want to do actually just extra large, I could do so. If you want to prevent this, right, if you want to have allow custom be set to false, this could be something where you could kick off a validation error or not allow users to potentially type in, even if you wanted to, right? There's a lot of different ways you can approach that. Same thing if we take a look at, like, filtering is the same as we saw with the autocomplete, right? But here we have the on-filter change event. It's a little bit of a different event, but still allows us to hook into what's happening as users are typing in. A big thing that we have in the combo box, because what we've seen across all of our different combo boxes throughout the years is that people love tossing in a ton of data into a combo box. So hopefully this comes through okay and go to webinar. If not, you'll just have to take my word for it. We have, excuse me, some buttery smooth scrolling performance here happening in the combo box with the virtualization enabled. So you can toss in thousands and thousands of data records in here if you like to, and allow users to scroll through it. It might be hard for people to find that particular entry, so you can still also use, virtualization with filtering if you like to, in order to be able to filter down the entries a little bit to something more manageable than just that big long list. But you're still not restricted, of course, to how much data you throw at it. I think at that point, it's more how much data do you want to have loaded on the client, for example. But that's a different story. Throw as much data as you want to into this component. If I jump over to the StackBlitz example for this component, again, we notice the main.view file, and it is just as easy as we saw previously with, and I can even hide this a little bit, with the AutoComplete, where all you have to do is we import the combo box from Progress Kendo View dropdowns, and then you have the combo box element you can include here, data-items, now hook into sports, which is actually something that we have in our model down here. And if we allow custom, this can be flipped on and off through this, in this particular demo, right, through this checkbox. But of course, if you want to set this to true or false, you can also do that as well. So you have some options for how you can, of course, work with these configuration properties. So nothing too crazy. Virtualization is also very easy to add in. As we can see here, there's a couple of different things that you might want to keep in mind. For example, because in order to deal with virtualization, we think of things as pages, so you can still load this in batches. So if you want to, you could involve something where you're loading data from the server side as you're going through and doing this virtualization. But that's why we have things like, for example, total, skip, and page size that allows you to customize a little bit how much data you want to pull in at once. I find this very useful if I, for example, throw this in with custom rendering and maybe do something a little bit more advanced than just an emoji and text. Maybe I have a very custom layout for each item. If I'm loading a ton of data on the client at once, I might want to have maybe a smaller set of data that I'm loading in at once as I'm virtualizing if I know the user isn't going to be scrolling through a lot. But this is something you can play around with, right? It all depends on how much information you're loading at once and what kind of behavior you're working with from users. But yeah, there's already, as you can see, right from the list of features, we try to think of as many possible scenarios out of the box as possible. So if you use the combo box in any one of the other Kendo UI packages, you should be able to find almost a one-to-one connection here in terms of configuration options, which is always exciting. We're trying to make these as feature complete as possible as we continue to roll them out, even from a V1 state.
Yeah, and it's not unreasonable to have large data sets here. I mean, you could think of google.com as a really big combo box, right? Like, so yep. It's definitely not a bad thing if you have thousands or even millions of things you potentially might need to show in here. So this just gives you some flexibility to do what you need to do.
Exactly. It can be a very simple combo box, 10 items. It can be 100,000 items that you load in here, right? And all it is, right, you still only select one particular entry, right? So I think that's the big thing here, but it still saves you on so much real estate. Imagine having to load 100,000 data items, right, from top to bottom, just for the user to select one thing, all in a radio group, right? That would be a little bit cumbersome to the user. So this is much easier for folks to deal with, and of course saves you on a ton of real estate, especially if you're adding this as a part of a form. Just makes it that much, I guess, more elegant to have included in your application. All right, and then the last component we have on the view side is the MaskedTextBox. So as I mentioned, right, this allows you to have actually work with a couple different masks. We even have the ability for, as you can see here, to include and support some built-in masks. So, you know, whether that's a phone number they want to set up or whatever it might be, but you have these options for defining your own mask. So you can make it completely customizable. If this is the format of your phone number, which I actually haven't looked up if there's a country that has this format for a phone number, but I do feel like it would be a highly populated country based on how many entries that we have here. If we want to, you know, again, a little shout out to my Bulgarian colleagues here, right? You can even do something where you have Cyrillic letters to start with, and then Latin letters afterwards, right? So you can mix and match this however you want, whichever way you want inside of the MaskedTextBox. So it's a super powerful component that generally I see a lot of people using this for. I keep on bringing up phone number, but zip codes, maybe like long and short zip codes, right, depending on how you want to set this up. But it really is, if you have an idea of a strict way for folks to enter data and you want that available in a text box, this is the component for you. It'll allow you to do that and enforce it without having to do a ton of checks yourself, right? As users are typing in, are they entering the right kind of character or text for that index?
Yeah, like redemption codes. You ever get one of those cards that has some weird pattern and you look at the card and you're like, well, do I need to put in the dashes? Like, this is a great way of making the UX very obvious to the user so they know exactly what they're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. And of course, it does also have integrated form support. So as you're building forms in your application, right, can very easily add this component in here. You can have, some validation requirements you can set up outside of the mask. You can define your custom messages. You can, we even have the ability for you to enforce the validity state if you want to be able to kind of force something through, right? So you have a lot of different ways that you can work with this component, and probably the most common scenario, which is of course forms, right? So yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can work with this component. And of course, something that we did bring up with, as I highlighted, the autocomplete in the slide deck, and this is something that you'll see across all the components, right, is accessibility. So all the components that we brought up today, they all follow WAI ARIA or WAI ARIA, however you want to pronounce that, standards, and that means we're also Section 508 compliant, and also, of course, WCAG 2.0 compliant across the board as well. So at any point in time, if accessibility is a concern of yours, and honestly, if you're not thinking about accessibility today, I would say that you should really start looking into it. But if you're using Kendo UI for View, you have that out of the box with all these components. So that means, of course, that if you're testing with screen readers, etc., you should have a fairly good time with the components. And if you, for some reason, do not, that's where we have support tickets and everything to make sure that we can tackle that. We take those issues as seriously as any other bugs and make sure that we are quick with resolving them if they do pop up. All right, so that's kind of what I had for the View demo section. So for those of you that joined us purely for the View portion, there might still be some questions that have popped up, but I do know that I have my helpful team of users going through and helping. And we have some of the engineers actually on the View components helping out and answering questions, which is super helpful. So I'll continue to let that happen, but I'm going to transition a little bit into KendoReact. And before I let TJ take over, there's kind of an announcement that I want to be able to get out there to let folks kind of know some upcoming changes that are happening to KendoReact. And I want to also ensure that this is an area where we can continue to have some feedback from customers. So you might have already had an email from me actually relating to this, but something that I wanted to cover is a change that we're doing with KendoReact right now is that we're looking into implementing a licensing mechanism for the NPM packages. And what this would be is essentially a license key will be expected for the KendoReact packages. And what this license key is going to do is essentially get rid of a warning message in the console. So rather than break the project, we're not looking to have something that we release and immediately breaks all of your projects. What we're looking to do is essentially have a warning message that displays in the developer console. So as you're developing, that says, hey, you happen to be using either an unlicensed version of KendoReact, or if you're a licensed user, we just are looking for you to apply the license key. It is a fairly simple process to go through, and we actually have everything highlighted right here on this URL. So I'm going to bring that up and leave that here as I'm chatting. So we have a couple of sample packages today already that we've tagged with @next. So it's the grid. We also have the date picker, as well as our inputs package that you should be able to pull those down and practice a little bit to see if this is something that works for you. And we, as I mentioned, we sent that email. We've announced this a little bit here and there and have been receiving some really good feedback that we have incorporated into the licensing mechanism already. But this is your chance. If you haven't had a chance to check that out or play around with it yet, like I mentioned, there are 3 packages out there that you do have to just do a specific command on npm to install, but it would give you a chance to go through and play around with it and ensure that this type of licensing mechanism works for you. And of course, we can incorporate any and all feedback into this as we continue to roll this out into more packages out there. So if you do have any feedback, you can always reach out to us on Twitter, of course, or you can feel free to either reach out through the support ticketing system, or I believe you can always reach out to me, like I said, on Twitter at Carl Bergenheim. I didn't include that here, but I'll just kind of mention that it's just my full name on Twitter, so you'll be able to find me there as well. So that's something that I wanted to get just chat a little bit about before we jump over to the latest and greatest. So TJ, I'm going to go ahead and with that, pop over to the KendoReact slide here and let you chat about what is the newest within our React components.
Perfect. I love when technology works. So yeah, I am TJ. I'm going to talk about the latest in KendoReact, and we're going to dive into the latest components and features. I do want to give one plug before we dive into that. So we're trying something new as part of this webinar for the React side of things. We're actually going to be jumping on Twitch about a half hour after this session ends. And we're going to be diving into the features, into a little bit more detail that I'm going to cover through this half-hour bit that I'm covering on React right now. So if you want to dive deeper, we're actually going to invite a few of the engineers from the KendoReact team. Carl and I will be here. So we'll be hanging out on Twitch. So if you have any questions that you want to dive deeper, if you want to see us live code something related to this release or related into KendoReact in general, go ahead and hop over to Twitch. Basically right after this, like I said, we'll start about a half hour after, and I'll give you one more reminder for this at the end. So this should be a little bit of fun. But for now, I'm going to cover the new components and new features in React, and there is a lot here. The first of our new components is the Gantt component. And for that, Carl, I've got a fun and useless fact for you. Are you ready for this?
Ooh, always.
So this is Henry Gantt. He is the inventor of the Gantt chart, and he looks exactly like you'd expect the inventor of the Gantt chart to look like.
I do love that mustache, by the way.
It's really an amazing mustache.
A little bit jealous of that, yeah.
And if you go to the Wikipedia page for Gantt charts, Wikipedia says that for many years, project managers used pieces of paper or blocks for the charts so that they could adjust them, without having to hand write them. So good news, if you've been using paper or blocks, you can now build these Gantt components through KendoReact, which is super exciting. There's also app bar, text area, chip and chip list, which I still think are weird names. We didn't come up with them. Rating badge loader, some new features to the grid, and the editor. And so I want to show all of these things off in action in an actual project. So I will do that in a minute. I will also mention real quick, Carl mentioned this for the Vue site, but our React demos and docs also got a little bit of a facelift, and really some of the underlying architecture, they're a lot faster. So you might have noticed this already if you've been playing around with the docs in the last handful of days, that they're snappier. And so kind of cool, something to notice. And if you use Kendo, like I use KendoReact, you basically live in these documentation pages and these demos. So these speed improvements, at least for my purposes, have really helped me out quite considerably. All right, so let's demo. And I'm going to switch over to my development environment. And what I have up here is my text editor with a sample project, and I've got it rendered over here. So I'm building an app for everybody's favorite fictitious company, Acme Industries. They always consistently just need everything we ship. It's just amazing how it works out. And so I've got every feature from my slides listed here. And what we're going to do is just go through each of these features, each of these components kind of sequentially, cover them in a little bit of detail in this application, and then I'll show you where to look on the docs if you really want to dive deeper. And as I said, if you are looking for a little bit more depth, we'll be on Twitch and we can dive into this a little bit more then too. All right, so first, the Gantt component, super exciting. So in this app, I've got like basically a holding area, I guess just like a blank screen over here that gives us a chance to use this thing. And right now I'm importing the Gantt components. I've already installed it from NPM to save us a little bit of time. And I'll just go ahead and like toss this in here, but it's not called Grant, even though it looks kind of like Grant. And to use it,
I always spell it with two N's accidentally and one T. Yeah, I never get it.
Yeah,
right.
It makes sense though that it's someone's name, because otherwise, like it wouldn't make any sense otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So to use this component, you need to pass it, at least in its simplest form, you need to pass it three things. So you need to tell the Gantt component which columns you want to use. And actually, you can render it right away after using this. And you'll see that a Gantt component or a Gantt chart is essentially a list of tasks, and the tasks are going to appear here. And it gives you a way of like planning how these tasks sort of relate to each other on a timeline. So these columns are basically what informational things you want to show here. And usually it'll be like a title and a start and end date are sort of the most common things to show. The next thing you need is a list of the tasks themselves. So tasks usually in Gantt charts have dates because that's what you're plotting on this area of the chart, and titles. You can nest these things as well. So if you have like a parent task that has subtasks, that's something that you can capture with this as well. So I'll pass this in also, call this task data. And then finally, the last thing you need is basically how these things relate to each other. So we call this dependency data. So I will toss that in, and I got to spell this one correctly as well. So we'll do dependency data, and basically this just controls how these tasks relate to each other. So I'm no expert on like Gantt theory and orchestrating, but basically there's ways of saying this task sort of depends on this, but how they relate and point to each other. So you'll see I created a dependency between two of my tasks, and that's why this arrow here was drawn. And if we go out to the documentation, so the Gantt component is a top-level component on the doc, so you can see it right under the components section. And you'll also see this one's worth maximizing because you can get into a lot more depth than I showed. So I wanted to show the basic, here's the basic things you need to understand how to create the world's simplest Gantt component. But you can get into have these tasks, the child tasks sort of indented, collapsible. You can get into some more complex relationships with how these tasks relate to each other. You can do sorting. You can do different views, right? I mean, if you wanted to get granular to show tasks within a day, you could do it. You could go at the month level. So there's a lot of different configuration in here. You can get into how to customize the slots. There's details on dependencies, so how you want the different tasks to relate to each other. So again, if that is something that you want to dive in more on, there's a lot of examples on the Gantt section of the documentation. But really, it's a super powerful component. There's a lot to it. Gantt charts are not known for being simple. So being able to do this through a component, like a React component that you just type Gantt, I think is pretty cool. And it's pretty simple to get up with the basics, and you can expand to build the complex things that you might need to build, depending on your needs. So check that out. But I'm gonna. Yeah,
it's definitely a super powerful component that I've used like in the real world once, like a actual Gantt, that somebody helped with project management. But up until that point, I just never understood them. But for those that need it, it's super useful. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's cool, like, because normally you have to use some awful enterprise-y software to use those things too. So being able to like write them in React in a way that you can customize it to meet your needs. Like if you hate the software you're using for it currently, maybe build your own, right? Build your own with KendoReact to take care of the hard parts for you. So it's kind of cool.
Plus you have all that data now that you can control and pull in, and it's no longer in an outside application, which is nice.
That's true too. You can control your task data, which is cool. All right, next on our list is an app bar. So an app bar is usually, you can put it at the top or the bottom of your screen, but it's a bar that looks something like this. And right now, I'm actually not using the app bar to draw this. I've just got like a div with a header and some stuff in it. And so I'm going to recreate this sort of thing using the built-in control, because why wouldn't I want to make my code a little bit cleaner here? So I've got the app bar already imported. So I'll go ahead and start with that. And when I save that, you'll see amazing. There's a bar with nothing in it. I did it. Very exciting. The next thing you'll want to do is add sections to this app bar. So one of the powerful things that KendoReact's app bar provides is a way of essentially sectioning off your app bar and then handling sort of the responsive nature of this for you automatically. So the first section is I'm going to bring back this button. So this is the same code I had before, but basically a button that just lets me open the drawer. So another KendoReact component, the drawer for this. And I'm going to keep going. So let's go down and add a few more things. So there's an app bar spacer, which as its name sort of implies, just allows you to give a little space in your app. So I'm going to put a little bit of space before another section that's going to contain the app's title. And just to show you some of the other things you can do with this, I'm going to paste in a little bit of navigation. So this is a pretty common pattern in app development to have a few links up here. So sometimes you would have this with a drawer, sometimes not. I just wanted to throw both in here so you could see the options that you have available to you. And then I also brought this avatar. This is the same avatar that was in here before. So this is another KendoReact component, and I'm using this section to throw it on this end of the screen. And you'll see that as I expand and collapse, KendoReact sort of automatically takes care of the responsiveness for me. So I didn't have to add any additional CSS to make that possible. And really now, like instead of div class header or whatever, I've got some pretty semantic looking JSX here to implement this. And I think it's kind of nice. So it's just a nice little helper component to build. A really common thing, like almost every app has an app bar, and you can move this on the bottom of the screen. I think if we go to the documentation, so this one's going to be under layout app bar. And I think if I go into position here, I think there's an example of one on the bottom somewhere in here. Static. Oh, you can make it like fixed as well. So that's kind of cool. So it's sort of another thing that's sort of annoying to do on your own. Oh, and there's one on the bottom. So again, configuration options, components, layout, app bar, just a nice little component that makes a really common UI pattern pretty easy to implement. So that's app bar. Next on our list is text area. And text area is sort of a continuation. If you were a part of our last release webinar, you might have seen us talk about the new form guidelines that we have in React. And so if you did miss that, it's under the forms section of the documentation and React form guidelines. And this is a really, really comprehensive document on how to do really all things forms with KendoReact, including solving some of the harder problems that you deal with React. And text area is more or less just a continuation of that work, just a way of making forms continuously improving it, making it a little bit easier to use. So there's really not a lot to this component. The main benefit of this is just that it plays nice with the other form controls that are part of KendoReact. So text area, you can give it a name. I do like that you can do auto sizing in this text area, meaning that when you type and you go to the end, the text box, the text area's height will automatically sort of adjust, which is kind of a nice little feature. It's kind of a painful thing to do on your own, but it's a nice little user-friendly thing. But again, you mostly want to use this and look at this in conjunction with the form guidelines. And I do think there is one, if you've ever had to do this sort of thing with the character counter as well from a text box. So the implementation of this is quite easy with the KendoReact text area control. So that's going to be on the input section, text area. So dive in there if you want to see some examples of how to use that in a little more detail.
Yeah, and I think a big thing here is like the integration with other aspects of our form component and then other form libraries out there, right? And being able to do things like hint labels, error labels, like all that kind of stuff has been added into the text area component as well to make it easy to use out of the box while still pretty powerful for text input.
Yeah, like if you look just like fitting into some of these other controls and the validation that appears as part of this. So definitely check this sort of thing out. It's more about just creating a more comprehensive form package as part of KendoReact. All right, next on our list is rating. And this one's a simple one that's kind of useful if you need it. The ability to create little stars and rate something. You can change the icons, so you can make these like hearts or whatever else that you wanted to control. And I do actually want to add this to our Acme app because I'm going to use this for a couple different sections. So we're going to create some problematic UI, Carl, if you're ready for it. So
I'm ready for it.
Yeah, exactly. So Acme has like their homepage is basically like an employee directory. And what's more problematic than giving each employee a rating on this very public homepage, right? Like, I don't know what could go wrong with that. So what we'll do is we'll generate a random rating for each person. So the good news is I'm not using real people, at least. That would probably be even more problematic.
If I saw my name in there and I randomly got generated a 1, I'd be...
Exactly. So I'm using Chance.js as a fun library to just generate random stuff. So if you ever need to build a demo like this, it's super useful because you can just generate random names and professions and emails. And I'm going to throw a random rating for these people in here as well. And the great thing about the rating component is like it's the world's easiest thing to use, right? I just type rating and I got to give this thing a default value. And the default value is going to be the person's rating. And just got to make sure I get my syntax correctly. And you'll see that out of the box, this thing just works, which is kind of cool. Now, you might not want to give people the ability to adjust their own rating, right? That would be bad. We want only important people to give these people ratings. So I'm going to set this to disabled so we can't control this. In a real world app, you'd probably want to leave this enabled until the person like does something and then maybe disable it after if it's already been changed. But again, it's a simple component that allows you to do this sort of thing. And so I'm going to mark that off. Like I said, you can go to the demos. So this is under the inputs control, and you can look at how to do, there's some ways you can custom render this, like if you wanted to show hearts or other icons, but really it's just a really simple control that if you need to show or even just display static ratings, it's kind of nice for that as well and something that you can do. All right, next component on our list is chip and chip list. And Carl, I will contend to my dying day that I do not like the name of this thing, but at the same time, I don't really know what I would call this otherwise because I don't know.
I know. It's something that the industry has decided is a chip, so it is a chip. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like, would you call these like pills? I don't even know. There's no real good name for this, so I will grant that.
Yeah. But pills is another alternative for sure.
But I do see I think the most common place I see these are for like filters, like you're doing shopping and you want to filter by like, I want to see men's shirts rather than women's shirts or something like that. At least are there other use cases I'm not thinking of? That's the one that springs to mind right away.
Yeah, I think in terms of modern UX and what I see the most of, that's something that in a way I think came from mobile applications first, but have made it over into a lot of desktop web applications as well, where you essentially provide like a common list of things to filter down from, and you can just select one or multiple, and then you can of course have more customized options beyond that. But it's a quick and easy way to use that for sure.
Cool. So that's good to hear because that's the use case I have in mind for Acme. Because when we're looking at this list, I mean, who really wants to see the 1 and the 2-star employees, right? I want to be able to just filter those people out because Sam Perry has just been pretty bad at being an executive recruiter lately. So I just want the ability to just single these people out, right? For whatever reason, because what could go wrong with implementing this UI? So what I'm going to do is implement a chip list to do this. And I'm going to paste in a little bit of code that I'm coming back to and explain here in a minute. But this is essentially going to be the individual like chips or pills within the chip list. So I'm going to create 5 different filters for like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 star of people. And I'm going to implement a little bit of state here. And you'll see in a second, I'll talk through this, but this is essentially going to be which filters are currently active or which chips you've sort of enabled more or less. And then finally down here, I'm going to put in a bit of code to actually show the actual chip list part of this. And I'll just save it because I think it helps to have a visual to explain this. So this is a chip list. And you'll see I pass this, first of all, selection multiple, which this means that I can select multiple of these. So you can also put this single if you want this to behave more like radio buttons, like you can only pick one of them. But in this case, like in filters, lots of times you want to show multiple because you're saying like you're enabling all of these things at the same time. For the default data, basically this is taking the individual, like which individual chips you want to be in the chip list. So the text is going to be what the user actually sees. And then the only other bit of code you need is a way of storing what things the user currently has activated. So that's why I've got a bit of state in here. Basically, I'm storing which filters are active. And by default, I'm saying I want all the filters active because by default, I want to show all employees regardless of their rating. And then on change, basically as the user interacts with this, all I need to do is just change my state just to make sure React keeps track of exactly which filters are active. Now you see that this component, this code actually isn't working yet because the last bit of logic I need to implement is just basically a conditional around these cards because basically I want to say only show these people if they match the filter. And so this actually isn't a KendoReact problem. This is just a React problem in general. So I could do some conditional like some Boolean here and card, that sort of thing. So that's a really common way of implementing this in React. But I've got a little trick. And Carl, you can tell me if you like this syntax. Maybe not. But there's this little component that somebody taught me this little trick a while ago. It's basically a custom thing just called render. And it basically says, and I'll actually show you the implementation of this. So I got this actually from Nathan Smith. I just stole his code directly. And it's just a little helper thing you write yourself that says, if this conditional is true, render it, else don't. And it only exists to make your code like a little bit debatably cleaner to actually look at. I like it. And what it allows me to do is say like, okay, now I do this and I want to only see 5-star people, right? Like Vera Bishop and Lee Singleton, absolutely star employees here at Acme.
I do feel bad for Sam because it might be his email or yeah, he or she, that email was tough to remember. So I'm sure that's a lot of people looking at that business card just typing in. So that's why they can't recruit people, I think.
Yeah, that's true. I'll use this render trick one more time. Like I said, it's Nathan Smith. It's kind of neat. And if you want me to dive, we can talk on Twitch later. We can have a debate as to whether this is cleaner code or not, but I happen to like it quite a bit. So I do got to make sure I start moving through this because it's got about 10 minutes left. The chip list is under the buttons section of the documentation. And the chip will show you different ways of like customizing this. So you can do things like show little avatars in here, different icons depending on like what exactly you're using these chips for. Like you can make them go away after you click on them, that sort of thing as well. So check that out. That's in the buttons section of the documentation.
And the difference for folks, I saw a question pop up around that. It's just the chip is an individual chip, and then the chip list just has logic for managing chips. So if you're deleting them, which items are selected, and if you want to be able to select one or multiple out of a list. So it's just some additional functionality on top of that, but exposed as a separate component.
All right, next on the list is badge, and I want to make sure I get through these. And the badge is one of those that's also just a little bit easier to, if you just see it, you kind of know what it is. So I have this what's new section on the header. And what I'm going to do is throw in a badge container component, which is new with this release, and throw a badge in here. And that's what's making this sort of dot appear up next to what's new. So this is a pretty common UI pattern. Slack uses something like this when you want the users to click on something to indicate something's new. The other thing too, I'm going to throw it in this avatar down here, is you don't have to do the little dots with the badge component. You can also do like this sort of thing, right? The whole notification bubble telling you how many notifications you can do. And really what KendoReact is providing, and I'll show where this lives in the docs so you can find yourself, is just a simple way of positioning this. That's why I had the badge container around it, is because it's handling all the messy aspects of making that show up in the right spot, regardless of whether you want, like you use this for like an online status indicator and put it on the bottom right, notifications. There's a number of different things you can do. There's some demos here too for positioning, because you can move these things around depending on, see top start, right? Move them around the thing depending on what makes sense for your UI. So it's again a nice little helper thing. Positioning these things is kind of hard if you've tried to do it yourself. So it's just a nice little helper component that makes it easy. So it's definitely worth checking out. All right, we got 8 minutes. We're doing pretty good on time. We'll make it through this list. So next is the loader. I'd say I'd add this also to the list of just nice little helper components that does something kind of simple, but is actually kind of nice. So in this case, the API is really, really straightforward. You just import the loader, and then in the code, you just use it, right? Like directly as is. There are some props that you can provide for the type of loader. So there are 3 different types of loaders built in. You can also control the size of this. But again, really simple, easy API, and it just prevents you from having to implement this sort of thing manually. And because I've yet to see an app that doesn't need a loader in some situation. So why not use a ready-made component that makes your life a little bit easier to implement this sort of thing?
Yeah, and it definitely makes the application pop a little bit, right? By having that little fun, kind of playful animation. And we have some appearance configuration options as well, so you can customize how things work. And of course, the color and everything like that. There's a lot of different things, as you can see here. And any combination of them can work, so.
Yeah, I'm a fan of infinite spinner. I think that's the right choice here. I don't think pulsing is the right default. So I'm sorry to whoever chose that default. I'd go with infinite spinner if I were you. I've done lots of research on this, so and it definitely matters. That's one thing for sure.
This is the hill we'll die on today.
Yes, exactly. All right, so I want to make sure, we're good. We talk about the new features of the grid and the editor to wrap up. And so for the grid, one thing you can do that's new for this release is lock rows. And so essentially what you have to do is the grid has always had a cell render prop, and there's a little bit of code you need to add to configure this kGridRowSticky class name, which is going to make the magic happen. And the magic is basically the ability to lock individual rows. So if you have a grid where users might want to compare and contrast, like maybe you've got a large grid of data, but they might want to say, how does the price of one item compare to all the rest? You can pin these. You can actually pin multiple rows, which is kind of slick, actually. It works pretty nicely. So that's something you might want to check out. This is in the grid, the rows, and the locked rows section of the documentation. So that's pretty handy.
Yeah, something that I think is fun too is when you scroll past it again, it'll actually unpin, I believe. And then when you scroll down again, it'll repin. So like it'll always be flagged as it needs to be pinned. But that way, I think that's a pretty like interesting part of the UX that it can come and go, but it will always just be marked as pinned.
This is very satisfying, actually. Like I could just do this for.
I did the same thing when I first saw the demo in action.
The next one is a customizable pager. And the way this works is essentially there is a new pager prop that allows you to, this is another sort of extensibility prop that's built in. This is actually one of my favorite things about the more advanced KendoReact controls is how really almost everything you see is customizable in one way or another. And so now the pager is as well. And basically what this lets you do, oops, if I scroll correctly here, is more or less just put anything you want down here. So in this example, the page number is changed. It shows different ways that you can configure the page numbers, like 3 different options. But really, this just gives you total control. So if you wanted to like slightly tweak how the default pager in KendoReact works, you could do that. If you wanted to rewrite it from scratch, that's something that you could do as well. So check this out under grid/paging.
And you essentially get access to the engine for paging, and then you can do whatever you want on top of that for a UX with this. So it's super flexible.
And the last one I'll show is we have a new demo related to locking columns with the column menu. So another sort of extensibility hook you have in the grid is the ability to basically create these column menus and make them work more or less however you'd like. And so now there's a way here that you can pin columns, basically meaning if I go in here and I lock, say, like the price column, right? I wanted my users, and actually this is probably easier to see if I make this even smaller. If I wanted the user to be able to lock a column on the side of the screen and to be able to then allow scrolling, basically you give the users control out of how to do this, and you could do this pretty easily through this extensibility hook that's now built into the column menu. All right, so we got about 2 minutes, so we gotta make sure we get through the editor stuff because it's pretty cool. So I'll show one thing first. Actually, let's do this. We have 2 minutes, and I can be pretty fast here. So the editor is, if you haven't used it before in KendoReact, it's one of those that's just kind of fun to play around with. So I want to show just like the basic syntax for people that haven't seen it before in action, because I actually think it's kind of fun. So really, all you have to do to use the editor is just bring in the editor component and pass it more or less just an array of tools that you want to use. And the number of tools that you can use is actually, I brought them all in here just so you could get a sense of how comprehensive it is if you want it to be. Or you could also make this thing kind of simple. Like I could just say bold, italic. And if that's all I want my users to see, I get an app and the users can bold and italicize text that appears here. You could also, so I also brought in the new ones because we're talking about this release. So the new ones are new tools to do things like control the text color. That one's text background, text color. You can now clear formatting. You can now print the contents of the editor, which I accidentally figured out does work yesterday. Fun fact, it does actually print the contents of the editor. So that was a fun use of a piece of paper. You can do find and replace. This is actually pretty slick, right? Because you're finding and replace directly within the editor, which is kind of nice for your users, especially if you're building a really advanced editor here where you're allowing your users to do a whole lot. So definitely check this out. And the very last feature on our list, there's a new demo out that talks about uploading images from the local file system. So one of the tools that was on my giant list is this one for working with images. And if you've used this before, you might have known that it was limited before to just using like URLs, like the image has to be hosted somewhere. But one thing you can now do is upload local images. So I can take my favorite image of my favorite dancing chicken or walking chicken, throw it in here. And if you're interested in this, under the editor documentation, there's this section on paste, drag and drop, and upload images, because there is a little bit of code that you need to add to make this sort of thing possible. But the demo walks you through this in quite a bit of detail. And all right, so I'm going to mark this off. And finally, the last item on the list, OCD, I need to complete this. because you might have noticed sort of as we were sort of cruising around both during Carl's and my segments, just how fast these things load, right? Like you can see the contents of these pages. So it takes a little while to load stuff from StackBlitz and such, but the actual pages render like super snappy and instantaneously, which makes at least my life easier showing this stuff. So hopefully you'll find it nice as well.
And I can't believe you did that, TJ. You managed to cover everything in the half an hour. So I know this puts up right up on time. So I'm just going to do a couple of things to wrap up for the folks that can't stay for an extra 3 or so minutes. Yeah. But one question that did pop up, by the way, around the editor was if we can add a custom button to the editor. And the answer is yes. You actually have the ability to not only add your own custom buttons, but you can even create your own custom plugins into the editor if you like to be able to extend functionality on top of that. So it could be a custom button that just does multiple things that we already exposed out of the box, or you could create something brand new and be able to implement that in there as well, so as a custom plugin. So it's a lot of different options.
And the last thing I'll mention, and then I'm done for this segment, is that if you do want to dive deeper into any of these questions that you might have, we're going to be on Twitch in about a half hour to talk about basically all things React related to this release, related to Kendo. So hop over there. It's twitch.tv/codeit_live. If you have any more of these in-depth questions, if you want to see us code something, if you want to challenge us, we'll do our best. So hop on there in a little bit.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks for that reminder. And I'm just doing some quick little wrap up. Let's call it housekeeping again. A couple of items that I know that people are have been asking about. So first of all, we are right up on time. So I know that if you have any questions, we've been answering them in the chat. I did, when you saw me looking down, I was looking at my phone to try to see what we had on Twitter. But everything that that we covered here, if we haven't answered you on Twitter, we will in a bit. But everything that we covered here can be found on TellReact.com/Kendo UI or KendoReact.com, depending on which product you're looking into. You also, of course, can see us blogging about anything and everything. So everything that we announced here is available on the TellReact blogs. And of course, we continue to blog about the products for various different topics. So TellReact.com/blogs for that. And I did have a slide for Q&A, but because we were right up on time, I'm just going to kind of end it on this slide and just thank everybody for joining us today. And if we happen to not get to your questions throughout the webinar, we'll be sure to try to reach out afterwards and address that with you. So thank you, everybody. And for those of you joining us on the Twitch stream, we will see you in just a bit. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.